All right, YouTube is telling me I'm live, so I guess I am live. Happy Wednesday. The circumstances, as as it tends to happen, kind of had me rejiggle the schedule slightly. So usually I try to put out a video today or tomorrow. Sometimes I don't know. It depends, and then I'll stream on Friday. Well, there's a con coming up, and I had to come up to Studio B. I'm in Studio B. So I couldn't get my act together on the video front. So I figured I would stream instead today and then probably get a video together Friday. I don't know. This might be a double stream week. We shall see. We shall see what they. We shall see what I was gonna say what they do. We shall see what. We shall see how things come together. I don't have. I mean, I have a bunch of stuff I want to talk about, but I don't know. I don't know which stuff I want to talk about right now. If that makes any sense. It will. We'll get it sorted. I will workshop that out. Hey, Frederick, glad you could join. So first off, a little housekeeping of sorts, or just I mentioned just now that I'm going to a con, and that con is EcclesiaCon, a 2025 edition that is in New Jersey. So it's a local con to me. It's really Palmyra, New Jersey. It's basically in the greater Philadelphia area. Philadelphia is getting a lot of cons. What's up with Philly getting just so much cons between PAX Unplugged and Page and EcclesiaCon? Well, you are not lacking for con action if you're in and around Philadelphia. As it stands, it's about an hour and a half away from me, which isn't bad. So I'm gonna roll out there. I haven't found the driving to and from Philly to be very taxing. Yeah, there's a little bit, the Jersey driving. I think you're on the turnpike. I think it's a turnpike. So, you got, and of course, getting out of New York City itself can always be, that can always be tough. But normally, for example, when I'm coming to Studio B, I have to basically drive. I'm going north. I'm going kind of northeast or northeast, somewhere like that. So, from where I am in Brooklyn to get out of the city going in that direction, I basically have to go through pretty much every other borough besides Staten Island. I don't necessarily have to go through Manhattan, but sometimes the traffic patterns mean that it's actually faster to go through Manhattan to get to where I need to go than to go through Brooklyn. It's just kind of the oddities. The Brooklyn Queens Expressway stinks. It sucks. Reminds me of I-10 when I lived in Houston. It's like you can't even. There's not a good time. It's terrible. Pretty much at any given moment, day or night, regardless of weather or anything, it's awful. So you never can tell. But getting to New Jersey, since I'm going essentially south, not quite. I don't know if it's quite due south. I guess southwest, something like that. It's a lot easier. And then there's tolls involved because I can go and coming north. You can, depending on how you go, you can save. You don't have to pay any money to get out of town. Whereas I'm gonna have to take the Verrazano Bridge. So this trip I'll go through Staten Island because I'm actually not far from Staten Island going over the bridge, so I can cut that way, go through Staten Island, hit New Jersey. But you have to pay. You have to pay for the bridge, and you got to pay for some other stuff. But other than that, it's a pretty easy drive. So I'll just be the con starts not tomorrow. Con starts on Friday in the evening, and just because I am driving and it'll be after a full day of stuff, I'm not up for that drive. But I'll be there on Saturday and probably on Sunday because I may need to leave. I'm not sure what the timing is for when I'm going to be there. I'm going to try to get there early, and then my daughter's talent show is Saturday night, so I have to be back for the talent show on Saturday, but then I'll be back on Sunday. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to do some talking to Dice Tales, Wes, who's the organizer, and they're going to have kind of a video area, and I don't know exactly what that means, so I'm going to take my own stuff with me, but I think I'm going to do some streaming from wherever that spot is, live from EcclesiaCon on Saturday, and I'll see what there is going on. I'm going to try to just wing it. Maybe there's some folks who are hanging out the con, some creators and stuff, get them to come over and chat, or maybe I'll just get some random folks who are enjoying the con who want to come over and chat, or maybe I will just yak on about this or that. So that's what I think we're going to do. I had some plans, or I had some ideas, but I just never kind of got them off the ground. I never got that inspirational aha, and I didn't work on it. I really, you talk about this getting, inspiration. This is true for anything, right? You're going to get inspired. And it's like, well, a lot of times inspiration comes off of working towards something. And I didn't put that work in to come up with something to do. Like to either run a game. I just didn't sign up to run a game this time, which I should have. Or I thought about, we could do a panel, and I could be part of a panel talking about something. And that, I just never came up with the idea. So I'm going to do this streaming video thing deal, hang out. I might jump in a game if there's an empty chair. I'm not going to take somebody's spot, but there's an empty chair somewhere, I'll jump in, or maybe I'll just kind of wander around, talk around, and then probably once I've got this done, then maybe next year try to do something better. Hey, Civet Sanctum said they live in Nashville. It's about the same here traffic wise. Yeah. It's such an annoying part of living in New York City that the hardest thing is just getting out of the city. Once you're out of the city, it's like, it's so relaxing and so easy to drive. But in the city, it's such a pain. At least the city doesn't sprawl. Houston, the traffic is, but the city just seems to go on forever. It just seems like you're, and then, technically you might leave Houston, but you couldn't tell because you're still basically in Houston. Or at least in New York, the boundaries are pretty firm. And not that long, but it's the worst thing. It's seeing like, you're 5 miles away. It's going to take you 50 minutes to get there. And you're like, I'm 5 miles. I could walk it faster if they had any way to walk there. Frederick says that they would think Boston is where all the cons would be on the East Coast. Boston's most 18 to 24-year-olds living there because of all the universities. They might, but Boston has a PAX. I don't know if they have anything else. There are some cons now in Massachusetts where I go to I go to ShireCon, which is Massachusetts. Now, granted, it's on the whole other side of Massachusetts, because I'm in Massachusetts as I'm recording this right now. Studio B is in Massachusetts, but Studio B is in Western Mass, and so is ClariCon, and then ArcaneCon is also essentially in Western Mass. Like, it's east from here, but west from everywhere else. There is another one that was actually fairly recent that I didn't get to, which is in Eastern Mass, whose name I'm forgetting. I'm going to try to maybe get to it next year. Could try to get to it, but I can't recall the name of it. I was just talking to Daniel about it a couple of weeks ago. Now I can't remember. But next year. So there's that one. Philly, I don't know if it's just because, with Philly, right? So Page, which is the Philadelphia Area Gaming Expo, which I hung out at this past year, that one's not exactly in Philadelphia. It's in the outskirts of Philly. It's in the greater Philadelphia area, but it's accessible from Philly. It's close to Philly. And EcclesiaCon is not in Philly itself, but you just look at the map and like there's this part of, and depending if you're not familiar with Philadelphia at all, there's the river, which is the Schuylkill River, I guess, that just kind of flows through. And basically, and the like, I don't know where the convention center is not really far from here at all. On the other side of that river is New Jersey. It's like you're literally like, it's if you think of New York City with the Hudson, right? And then one side you have New Jersey, the other side you have New York. But the Hudson's it's fairly wide. So you look at it, it feels like a real barrier. When the Schuylkill, it's not. I don't think it's as wide. It doesn't feel like it's as wide. It feels like it's just much closer. Like they're really like you're part of it. But it would be similar, I think, as far as EcclesiaCon, if they had held it in Jersey City or Hoboken or one of those New Jersey areas. That's literally essentially in the greater New York. It's kind of part of the greater New York area. You Civ ad Sanctum, you did see Daniel at Necronomicon. He was at Necronomicon. He and his partner went. I wish I'd known about it more in advance. I would have tried to get over it. It seems like a lot of fun. I know they do it only every 2 years, so I guess the next one's not till 2027 or 2026. Yeah, not this year, but next year there'll be 2026, right? Because it was 2024, the last one. I'll try to go. But yes, he got to go. I didn't get to go. Maybe next year. So there was some stuff around Boston. The Philly's got some good stuff. So I will be there on Saturday and probably on Sunday. Sunday's just a matter of how exhausted am I, what's going on, that kind of thing. My intention is to go on Sunday, so I'm not trying to shortchange myself. But sometimes you life can get the better of you. But my intention is to go on Sunday as well. But I will definitely be there on Saturday. So that's a CleeseCon. If you're around, especially if you're in the kind of Northeast and it's not too far from you, give it a shot. It's for a good cause. It benefits a local church and a booksmiles.org. So good causes, not too far away. You can, if you want to see me, you can come see me. I'll just be walking around. All right. Let's see. I guess I'll show. I have this here. I posted this. So over on the other channel, if you missed it, I streamed yesterday. I'm probably not going to stream over there today because I'm streaming over here today, and I got to pack things up and get out of Studio B and head back to the city. So, but I did post this as a devlog to the Joy of Hex Maps where I was working through, and I have some. So this image, so I picked a region, I rolled randomly for a region, and I just filled it up using the Joy of Hex Maps procedures, and then using the kind of beta hex stocking stuff, I stocked it with some sites and some habitations, also kind of rolled randomly, and then I've been going through and filling them out, and I went through it all on a stream yesterday, so if you don't follow the other channel, the Behind the Screens channel, you can check that out, and it's also, if you go to the Joy of Hex Maps on itch, you can see the devlog where I posted a couple of pictures of it. I just figured I would show it there because I just posted this morning. And now I think if I don't think I have anything. I don't think I have any other notes. So we can look at some blog stuff. These blogs I pulled from the OSR Discord group. We could start there, and if we have time and space, we can always go to Reddit to supplement. But I figure I'll start here. This is another. I say another from the other stream on yesterday. I was drinking a different can of this, but this is Mandarin Orange Seltzer from the local supermarket for the working man. Tennessee has 2 great Ren fairs, says Frederick. Interesting. I go to the New York Ren Fair pretty much every year. So if you ever go to the New York, whatever the one in New York's called, because they're not state fairs, they're not states, but I go to that one. I used to go to the Texas one or the one outside Houston often, and that was a lot of fun. If I can ever get myself to visit some friends in Houston, which I need to, I should try to time it and go to the Ren Fest down there, because it's a really nice one, big one to be. I hadn't gone to the New York one yet when I was going to that one, so I feel like it'd be cool to compare them. It would be neat. Look, if I could ever get things straightened up where it's like, ooh, I'm just gonna retire and just do videos and podcasts and do kind of content creation. I would love to do something where I travel around and go to a bunch of different Ren Fests. I'm sure some YouTube channels already done it, but regardless about whoever's already done it, it'll be just fun to do. I have no idea if you plotted them out on a calendar, if you could hit a bunch of them or if they kind of overlap in timing. No idea, but it would be fun. So let's look at this one. How I stopped worrying and dropped the fighter from my game. This is posted. This is a devlog for what? Oh, for I guess this game has no fighter, which I'm not familiar with, but I saw the post. Okay, so and this is Luva. Hold on, what's my glasses? Luva SGG or Luvas GG, not sure. Apologize for any name mangling. Later, I've been delving into playing games with a black box FKR style. However, I didn't want to pull all the strain of quote-unquote coming up with what you're playing tonight on my players. Something I really like about games that have character options is that those options inform players about the game world just by existing. So I set out to write a few bare-bones archetypes that players can lean on and jumpstart both their imaginations and their understanding of what type of world they'll be playing in. I decided to start from the 5th edition classes because I like how the idea of those classes inform the setting. Quickly, I had dropped some of the classes and distilled others to what I believe was their core fantasy. At the point, the rogue had turned into the expert, a skill monkey kind of archetype that specialized in a few things freely chosen by the player. And the fighter had turned into the strategist, a master of combat who would be able to strategize around their foes. I then wrote something else on the expert. You see, I was trying to get across the idea that the expert was just like the rogue and would be able to backstab, but I wanted to do that in a way that didn't clash with the open-ended format of the archetype. So I wrote words to the effect of, you can detect weak spots in your enemies and their defenses. I then realized that that should be something the strategist should do, so I dropped that aspect of the expert. But it got me thinking. I was already unsatisfied with the write-up on the strategist and how it was lacking something, but I couldn't put my place on what. I then realized if someone wanted to build an expert who was good at combat, they not only would be able to, it was probably going to look sexier than the strategist. I then realized why. The strategist was just an expert. Holy ish. This is how I ended up dropping the archetype that was based on the fighter and folded it into one based on the rogue. This made quite a lot of sense to me. I think distilling both those classes into one archetype has some bearing on a lot of discussions I've seen online about elf games, though I won't go further into these here. As to my archetypes, I ended up dropping a lot of the other classes in the end. While I started from 5th edition, I found myself ending up in BX. I think that says something about the game as well. Anyways, I've conjured up a leaflet with the archetypes and a few suggestions for referees that I will link here, though it is a half-assed job at best. I'm not your boss, nor do I want to be, so I found writing more words had no use to anyone. And without further ado, okay, so we'll take a look. This is called This Game Has No Fighter, kind of. I think really what's happening, Rel, talk about bare bones. Their itch page is extraordinarily bare bones. Frederick says a fix for a thief is, what is this? Dim Mac. With careful study, you find the most. What's dim Mac? I don't know. With careful study, you find the most vulnerable spot to strike. I mean, that's basically just back them. I think really what I feel like this person, the journey they're going on, there's a little fly on my monitor, is really just like a classless kind of thing. Because yes, I should say a skill-based game. Because really what the skill-based game says is that everybody is an expert in something. Now pick the areas you're an expert in. That's skills. You're doing that in a skills-based thing. GURPS, Call of Cthulhu, whatever those kind of skill-based, insert your skill game of choice. That's kind of what you get at, right? I think the idea with the archetypes is that it's not just about it's about more than that. There are many ways to skin this cat, and very few games really kind of nail it. I mean, D&D, right? You want to you on the one hand you want to say something like, oh, well, D&D's talking about archetypes, and I think that's true when you're looking at, say, the original. When you're looking at maybe fighter, yes, that's definitely an archetype. Magic user, that's definitely an archetype. Cleric, already you're kind of going, is it? Because it's kind of magic-y, it's kind of fighty. It's not, what is the archetypal, you could say like the mysticist or something, like someone who uses faith or belief or something, but that's not really, the cleric's magic is powered theoretically by that stuff, though we never deal with that, in a game with a cleric. Other than some GM or some deciding like you've overstepped the bounds and your god frowns upon you, whatever. We never, as a cleric, you're not day to day dealing with any of that stuff. And then, but that's not really strong enough. And then you have the thief as like the skill monkey kind of thing. Okay, you could say the archetype is a skill monkey, but then as kind of again like this person sort of thinking about but everybody's kind of a skill monkey. It's that they're a skill monkey in they've got these different areas. A wizard is supposed to be a skill monkey in terms of kind of mystical arts. The fighter is a skill monkey in terms of things, but you say, well, the thief kind of broadens them all. But if you're going to have the thief kind of be broad in them all, then the thief can't be better than, if you're going to be the thief is picking in a lot of different areas kind of thing, or the rogue, that's their deal. Well, then you can't, by definition, then you should not be able to get better than the specialist, which is probably why you shouldn't call it the expert, which makes it like the fighter is the expert in warfare. The mage is the the expert in magic. The rogue, it's like they're a little bit, they're that jack of all trades. Oh, we're a little bit here, but right, it's because the saying is jack of all trades, master of none. They're not as good a fighter as a fighter because they haven't spent all their time fighting. They're not as good a magic user as a magic user because they haven't spent all their time studying spells. But you want to have a little bit of both. And I think this is kind of the issue at the heart of a lot of the stuff with characters and things, especially when you get into kind of modern D&D, is that everyone, and the way modern D&D plays, everyone should kind of be good at the same things. But then, like, what happens when you're stepping on the toes of the like, and this happens a lot with the fighter, right? If everyone's going to be great at combat, then, like, what is the fighter? Why do you need just a plain fighter? If everybody's going to be just as kind of competent, like, what is the fighter really? And that's when I think you end up with, like, with 4th edition, you kind of do, and maybe 5th edition to a similar degrees. You know, you try to set the fighters. Well, you're the defender. You're the tank type. But what happens if you don't want to be the fighter and you don't want to be a tank? Then it's like, well, you're better off being a rogue doing this stuff, or you're better off being a magic user doing this stuff. And, you know, not a right answer. Ain't that the bard? I mean, the bard, well, Brian, I guess the bard has become that kind of, but it was originally, you know, the thief kind of touched upon that stuff, right? A thief could start to read scrolls. The thief could, you know, could do certain things. The thief had kind of backstab, right? I think that's I guess to Brian, to your point of the bard, is this is where I think when you look at D&D first and saying these are archetypes, not diegetic roles, right? It's not your occupation, right? That, like, thing, a fighter, it's obviously your occupation in D&D, at least, you know, at the beginning, was you're an adventurer. If you had to take a census, write down your census answer, some guy comes up to the tavern with a clipboard and says, could you please write down your age, name, age, occupation, right? Everyone would say adventurer, right? That's adventurer is your occupation. So then what is your class? Your class is this kind of concept, this archetypal concept of how do you get things done? Okay. But then when you get to a point where you start going, well, what about barbarian? What about a bard? What about illusionist? What about you end up, as the classes grow, you quickly leave the realm of archetypes behind, because there just aren't that many archetypes, really. When you boil it down, I use a variety of skills to get things done, aka the rogue. I use physical strength and those kind of things to get things done, aka the fighter. I'm using magic and mystical forces to get things done. You're a magic user. Maybe you could think of a fourth one, but that's it. Everything else ends up being just flavors of that. And so what separates a druid from a magic user, it's now you're getting these diegetic things, like, no, I am a druid. I believe in whatever the religion of the druids is, and I follow druidic commandments, and I am a druid. That is kind of my occupation. But also, you're also an adventurer, but, you know, you're sort of this other thing. Or I am a bard, which, what makes you a bard as opposed to just a rogue is that you play an instrument, and you do that. And then, of course, they differentiate. So they all say, no, bards cast spells. Rogues can read, you know, they may be able to read spells, but they can't cast spells. Bards can actually cast a few spells. Okay, but do you need a bard and a rogue for the? Well, you know, no, because bards don't get backstab and rogues get backstab, and okay, but you're into that kind of diegetic stuff of, because this person took these particular skills, we're going to siphon this off and say, no, you're a bard, and otherwise you're a rogue. I mean, of course, and it started off that a bard was a flavor of rogue, and then they split off on their own, just like a barbarian was at one point a subclass of fighter, and then they moved it off into its own thing. It just gets all kinds of confused, right? So I think you kind of got to make this decision about, are you going to be diegetic, in which case kind of you're a fighter, because I don't know, there are people called fighters. Maybe we call them mercenaries, soldiers. And that's sort of what you do, or that's what you did until you became an adventurer. Or we could say what's kind of an archetype. But if you're an archetype, we don't need that many, because there aren't that many archetypes. At least, you know, I would say kind of major archetypes that are sort of useful. Brian says, I think this OP is at odds with wanting to simplify everything down, but also splitting the archetypes back up. Well, they don't really talk about archetypes so much. They're simply talking about how, when they're looking at the fighter and their rogue, that really, you could look at it and say a rogue that wants to be good at fighting is a fighter. And then you kind of look at, like, well, I mean, it's kind of like saying everyone's an adventurer, and then what did you specialize in? And so as your adventure, you have one adventurer class that everybody fits into, and then you just kind of allocate your points to where you want to be. I want to be a good fighter, so you allocate more points to fighting, or you allocate points to stealthiness, or you allocate points to some other thing, or you allocate points to magic. So basically, it feels like you're kind of at the, just go with a skill go with a skill-based, system, I guess. But this is things that I'm kind of riffing on what they're saying rather than what they're saying themselves. I won't download the thing though. I'll have to come back and check it out. So let me I will add this to my collection. All right, moving on. So this one was posted by Dice Goblin. Oh, I should have put. Let me link to that. Sorry, I didn't. I forgot. I should have done my duties. I'll link to this. This game has no fighter. Kinda. All right, that's been linked. Okay, now we're moving on. This was posted by Dice Goblin. Of the virtue and folly of man, dwarf, and elf. I'm just going to link that. If you want to follow along or read it at your own leisure later. Okay. All right, so this is I think the author of Block, Dodge, Parry, which is a supplement for, is it Into the Odd or Cairn? Both? I'm not sure. All right, so they're working on a big hex crawl, and they're looking at tools, methods, and procedures to help flesh out their setting. Great. Okay. I want it to be relatively classic. Oh, so sorry. I'm speaking now. This is Lars speaking from their POV in the article itself. I want it to be relatively classic in feel. Humans, dwarves, elves, sprawling wilderness, ancient ruins, the whole shebang. I'd like to avoid some of the things that I consider quote-unquote pitfalls in design and world building. Or to put it differently, I'd like to challenge myself to work around concepts such as sentient races that are always evil, bioessentialism, and colonialism. Given that the classic D&D experience is Renaissance technology in a medieval coat of paint with Western themes of expansion, wilderness, and dangerous natives, I have my work cut out for me. However, I'd also still like ways for there to be, say, 1d6 orcs as an encounter or 3d6 goblins ambushing your camp, without everything being heavy all the time. I was thinking of an old Mindstorm blog post, as I often do, and you should too, particularly the one that includes world anchors. The way in which the themes of the campaign would be interpreted on a spectrum of abstraction is really neat, a dial that can be turned to adjust the impact of themes on a campaign. Virtue and folly. Each ancestry found in the setting has virtues and follies. This does not mean each member of said ancestry embodies each aspect or even embodies it at all. It's more that if meeting a, quote, very dwarfy dwarf, unquote, or a, quote, very elfish elf, unquote, their character is likely to have a clear relation with their ancestry's virtues and follies. This could mean that they embody each or that they explicitly resist embodying them. This is not about individuals. It's about cultural and traditional tendencies within the larger group. These virtues and follies are, quote-unquote, divinely ordained. This is just how the gods made these people. And I mean, it's true. The warden or dungeon master has set these as the defining conflicts or tensions. The problem with this, though, not that it's a problem, but that this is the same thing that people say with the such a race is always evil. So it's interesting that they're falling on the same explanation because, what you hear about, and I did this ages ago because I was not mad. I really could not care less. I have a hard time finding a way to care less about what wizards or really anybody does with a particular species in their game. And the fact that people got all outraged, I found it especially amusing in a way that people probably got most outraged about it were the people who weren't partaking in the product anyway. Like you got all these grognards who are not playing 5th edition, not touching 5th edition with a 10-foot pole, railing against 5th edition, doing something with the orcs in 5th edition as if it has anything to do with them, as if it impacts them at all, but whatever. Get outraged at what you want to get outraged about. But, the excuses or the reasons they would say, well, no, this is what Grumsh One-Eyed created. The Grumsh created orcs in this way, and that is why they are evil. That's why I say always should be evil, because Grumsh, right? This is the story. And so the interesting thing here is this person clearly wants to get away from that, which I'm totally on board with. But the system they're going to, not that there's anything wrong with it, but it doesn't feel much different than what the orcs thing is. Only you're saying two things. You're giving the caveat that, hey, not everybody has to be this way. And B, but B, it's divinely ordained. Whatever those things happen to be, they're divinely ordained. But that is the same reason people gave for the other one. The divine ordination. I know that I've struggled a bit, and I feel like my current thinking in the kind of setting stuff that I'm working on is I just want to get rid of all of them. I'm not getting rid of humans, though that's almost tempting in a way too. But again, getting rid of the elves, the dwarves, and trying to do something just different. But I'm also bumping up against the problem, so I'm definitely empathize and sympathize with the problem of you still want to be able to say like, hey, 1d6 orcs or something, right? And the way I've been going is leaning into being more individual. Like there's not these just huge species of things out there outside of kind of humans and kind of animals and things like that. But at the same time, then how do you end up with if everybody's kind of a one of one? How do you end up with 1d6 of something? And I haven't figured my way around that one yet. But it's just it's an interesting. I think the path they're on is interesting, and I'm not trying to throw a shade or anything, but it's it's using the same kind of methodology that the old system used, but with a slightly different. I mean, obviously the one big caveat, right, is it's not a everybody is like this, right? But though I think even with the people with orcs are evil, I imagine that they would allow for there being individuals who are not evil. I don't know. I can't really speak for those people. I'm not sure. Anyway, back to what they're doing. Okay, this also means that in natural language or in universe, characters could refer to the quote-unquote folly of men or the quote-unquote virtue of dwarves, which I think sounds cool. Below is an example, default interpretation of virtues and follies. I think having these defined as you world build can help flesh out details as well as conflicts between various groups. Radically changing certain aspects is also likely to have very interesting results. So here we have some classics. So humans, their virtues are ambition and adaptability. Their follies are pride and legacy. Elves, their virtues are mastery and harmony, and their follies are stagnation and arrogance. Dwarves, their virtues are steadfastness and craftsmanship, and their follies are greed and grudge bearing. And remember, I think they're going here for just your kind of vanilla fantasy ones. I don't think they're putting much of a spin on this by design. Halflings, their virtues are contentment and community, and their follies are complacency and insulation. Orcs, their virtues are vigor and directness, and their follies are domination and impulsivity. Goblins, their virtues are ingenuity and brotherhood, and their follies are servility and mischief. And then hobgoblins, their virtues are discipline and strategy, and their follies are tyranny and rigidity. So it means interesting, right? I feel like that this is, I mean, it's all about who's going to use this tool, right? Because I think in the hands of somebody else, you can end up with the exact same things you end up with the classic systems, and it's just the same. And then someone who doesn't look at it, someone who is apt not to look at this in a kind of baseline manner. I just don't love. I guess if we're going to get rid of it, I just feel like we should get rid of it and not say things like humans have these certain. I mean, as a species, right? I feel like these are really cultural things. And I think if we really want to drill down into it with this kind of system, I would do it as cultures. That it's not about whether you're a human or an elf or a dwarf in this sense. It's what culture you're in. So we could say something like we might historically that the Romans, right? The Romans of the Roman Empire, whatever, definitely ambitious. And I think you could say that they were had great endurance as people. I mean, they would just absorb massive losses. I mean, you look at the Carthaginian wars, and they probably put up with things, Hannibal rampaging, I mean, in central Italy, just going around doing stuff, taking these huge losses to him and doing all, and you persevering, right? That perseverance of like, no, we're good. We're going to call up more guys, and we're going to just keep, if we have to go into a meat grinder, we're going to just go into a meat grinder. And, you're going to do this and you're going to tire yourself out and leave before we've get up. Like, that's how we're going to do that. Like, that probably was a big, at least to me, I look at like that's a big hallmark. And you can also look at, they also had this folly of kind of legacy, being remembered, being one of this driver of having to be kind of the best. And when it turns bad, because it was also part of that ambition was part of what brought them to I'm going to call it quote unquote greatness, because I think you could certainly make arguments that it was far from great for them, I guess. But that same kind of, that flip side was driving people to ever and ever more. And that leads to your Caesars and other folks who, can't, can no longer find they can work within the system, right? That they try to burn the system down. And then of course the kind of, I guess the kind of decadence and that kind of thing. But I think if you put it as a culture, as opposed to a whole species, one, it's just not as easy, because you got to come up with the cultures. If I'm going to have a few cultures of, if I just say humans, that covers a whole species. Great. If I'm going to have 4 main humanoid playable species in my game, I just have to do 4 times, right? Oh, okay. Humans, elves, dwarves, halflings, let's say. Great. But if I'm going to do cultures, it's more complicated. But I just think you end up with something that's more. One, I think it more mirrors our experience, because I think when we look at different cultures, we can see these different how people kind of arrange themselves. Like we can even see in Italy a difference between, if we were taking the Italians from, I don't know, the unification of Italy in the 19th century to Rome. Yeah, there's a few hundred years, maybe 1,000 years, or 1,500 years. No, I don't know, depending when you want to put, halt the lines, different, but they have it there. It's a different culture. Or even if you were going to say Turkey or the Ottoman Empire, maybe even the Ottoman Empire to Turkey, or the Ottoman Empire to the Byzantium, and you could see these kind of differences. So I like the idea, the concept of coming up with a virtue and folly. I think I would link them to cultures rather than species. If we really want to wipe our hands with all stuff, hey, I don't want to deal with that kind of stuff anymore. I don't know if you can really get there. I don't know if you can really get there without ditching it completely. Like, I feel like you just kind of gotta do it. You're going to do it, do it. Cut the cord, go all the way. But it's an interesting concept. I'm curious what the comment says. Let's look and read that. Posted by Daniel. Oh boy, the comment is almost as long as the article. So Daniel wrote, "Oh boy, you are right. This is a tricky one. I can see where you're coming from, but I think you may be missing the mark. In your defense, the work is made so much harder for you, because so much of what makes up a classic feel for RPGs is steeped in bioessentialism and colonialism. I'm not here to be critical. We can all agree that the big classic RPG influences were very much a product of their time. Virtue and folly sound great in a classic Tolkien-esque way, but they are really a fancy way of saying racial stereotype. And I would really recommend moving away from these stereotypes being divinely ordained, because that is what people used to believe in real life, and not an insignificant proportion of the population still does, and used it to legitimize a whole lot of very bad things." And I would also agree with that. I honestly don't think you can break away from the ick of classy RPGs and maintain the race as culture perspective so popularized by Lord of the Rings, particularly as JRR explicitly based his races on real-world cultures. One thing that could help is to stop thinking of core organizational groupings as species and think instead of factors. Give the factions perspectives, gods, misunderstandings, and prejudices, and then populate them how you like. They could be any mix of species or species exclusive as you see fit. You still get your 2d6 goblins attack, but it'll be 2d6 unseelie gang members on a blood hunt attack. Nothing's stopping you having evil factions that want to eat you, just don't make them all one species. Like, you could say that all members of the Unseelie gang are goblins, as they are a species supremacist group, but not all goblins are members of the Unseelie gang. The other thing is you can just not assign personality traits at a species level. It is oddly controversial, but you just don't need them. Check out Wildsea for an example of this. They have species ranging from humans to cactus people to a hive mind swarm of spiders in a person suit, and at no point does it say X are like Y. This was a conscious choice by the creator. His view is that you can play your skin bag of spiders whoever you want to, because GMs and players are always going to do that anyway. I think that's very good points. I don't know about Wildsea, though that sounds interesting. And he goes, "I'm not going to read this whole response. There's a whole good conversation going on there." Yeah, I mean, I would tend to think, like, let's just ditch it. If you have to, and the thing is, like, I understand the concept of saying you want to be able, I think part of the problem they're trying to address, I guess, speaking here for the author, is that you're looking for, how can I make it easy? There's a shorthand. When you say 1d6 orcs in a room, we all kind of get the shorthand for that, and that saves us a lot of work. I like what that commenter Daniel was saying about, and I was saying as far as cultures, but factions, it's the same thing, really, is you creating these units, and then instead of saying goblins, you say unseelie gang members, which gives you your kind of goblin types, and just do that instead. It just takes more work. It's kind of like, well, how much work do I want to do to get to a certain place? And do I care enough about it? Is it meaningful enough to me to put in that work? For myself, my answer is, yeah, it is kind of meaningful enough to me, and I want to do that. It might not be for anybody else. But I guess what I appreciate is that this author is taking the time out to try to do this and then talking about it so that we can have, these discussions. All right, moving on. This is a session report for Sailors on the Starless Sea. We've looked at Sailors on the Starless Sea on the channel. It's been a while. But, it's a fun adventure, and I'm always a fan of session reports. So I thought we could check this one out. And I say this every week that I do one of these, every time I do one of these, but if you've got stuff, if you've got a blog, if you're posting things somewhere, share them, send them to me. I would be more happy to read things by folks in the community than read things by folks I don't know anything about. So, Terrence says, checking work desired 0. So please send me stuff, because that would save me having to go through and just pick kind of random stuff. This is from Goodbye to a Shoes RPG blog. Session report for Sailors on the Starless Sea. My new Dungeon Crawl Classics campaign began, as many first-time DCC campaigns do, with Harley Stroh's much-loved zero-level funnel adventure Sailors on the Starless Sea. It took us 2 sessions rather than 1, but that was expected since I walked everyone through character creation manually, and also because we were roughly constrained by my son's midday nap time. Oh, and I guess I should say, spoilers, if you don't know Sailors on the Starless Sea and you think you're going to play it rather than run it. I don't know if they're spoiling it, but I have to assume they will. What follows are some assorted notes on my specific experience running the funnel. This isn't a review exactly. There are enough of those for this adventure especially, and probably won't be of much interest or even comprehensible if you aren't already familiar with the module, as I'll be mainly addressing as stuff what I did rather than running through the module as a whole. I did make a very, very minor mistake right from the jump. When originally planning for this session, I wasn't exactly sure how many players I'd have, and so I decided that if I had 4 players, they'd each have 4 characters, and if I had 5, they'd have 3 characters, for 16 or 15 PCs total. This made sense to me at the time, only a difference of 1 total PC. What a clever use of math. What I forgot is that Sailors has a recommended PC count of 10 to 15, so I ended up with 4 players. That put me 1 above the recommended amount of PCs. This is so trivial as to barely be worth mentioning, but I do think being at the max recommended, or 1 over in this case, party size did make it a little bit easier than the much hyped funnel experience is supposed to be. The players made it out with 11 PCs still alive in total, losing only 6, including a single reinforcement. Not exactly a meat grinder. Of course, it could simply be that the players were rolling fairly hot, which they were. I believe I've seen some reports of people running it with as many as 20 PCs and still having a fairly deadly experience. So if you're not familiar with funnels in DCC, it's where you don't start with one level 1 character. What you do is you start off with basically a bunch of level 0 normal types, and you run them through, and then whoever survives, you can then pick from them to kind of turn into your level 1 PC. So it's basically a fun way of having this kind of meat grinder experience, and then at the end you're gonna, I presume, I haven't really played. I've read Sailors on Starless Sea, as I mentioned, we read it on the channel. I haven't played through one of these funnels in DCC, so I don't know if it's at all likely that you could end up with none of your people surviving. But I imagine you get enough. And I think even if you were to get none, there are ways for them to feed you more people if you need them. And so I think it's a really great, again, having not played it, but the concept seems really fun to me in that you're taking a bunch of things of individuals, these classes, these characters you're creating. God, characters just fell out of my head. But you know they're level 0. This is I presume that it's being told to you that, hey, this is a funnel. It's going to be dirty. It's going to be mean. It's going to be violent and deadly. So you don't have any, you should not be going in there with any favorites or really any attachment to a particular character. But I think through playing this and coming up with, probably by the end of it, some of the ones that survive, one of those will probably be someone you have an attachment to. And then you take that one and you elevate them. So I think it's really fun. And DCC does, has a few of these. I don't know how many exactly. They have a bunch of these, they call funnel adventures for these level 0 types. And this one's Sailors of the Starless Sea is probably the most famous, most well-known, I would think. Okay, back to it. The other thing that made the adventure less deadly was the fact that I removed the very first encounter with divine horrors, and my understanding is that can be a fairly brutal first combat with their 2 actions a turn. Still, I don't think this was a quote-unquote mistake. As Stroh himself remarks in the bonus content in the current printing of Sailors, the horrors feel a little bit out of place as is. And I think it suits the adventure and simply the style of play better to start at the wide open gate of the keep rather than the more or less unavoidable as written combat. I considered adding in the bonus area that expands upon the horrors, but decided against it, as with our more limited time, it would definitely have turned the adventure into 3 sessions. If I ever ran Sailors as a level 1 adventure rather than a funnel, I think I would use the horrors, including the bonus area. Otherwise, I think it makes sense to leave them out. Okay, I got something on my finger. One of the things I did when prepping the adventure was find any test or check where there was no outcome from a failure and consider ways to make the failure more meaningful. Surprisingly, for an early DCC module, there weren't too many of these, the most notable being the heavy door leading to Phelan's tomb, which requires a DC 20 check to open. My very minor rework to this was to allow one PC to open it on a DC 20, and if they failed, allow 3 PCs to open it without a check, thus exposing all 3 PCs to the fire trap rather than just one. However, they didn't bring down the wall concealing this entrance, and therefore my very clever solution didn't see any use. So it goes. Yeah, that's an interesting one. So you got to, it's trapped. So it's kind of like, well, you failed. Do you want to open it with 3? And then they all open it, and so you're like, okay, and they all get burned. And they all get burned out. I'd be curious I think that's a good. Not that particular one is. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it, but I think it's a good idea to think about what happens on failures. One, because anything that happens helps move the story forward, if only to giving a sense of urgency or a renewed sense of danger or up in the tension. Then just nothing happens. Like you try to hit the door and you try to bang that door down and you don't bring it down, but so there's a deep boom and it seems to reverberate. Like, oh, now you're like, oh, okay, because did we wake something up? Something coming? It just adds a whole other thing to it, as opposed to just, oh, you hit the door, nothing happens. Nothing. But that specific one's kind of funny because on the one hand, it feels like you're inviting them. Well, listen, I will let you open the door if you have 3 people instead of just the one. And then, of course, then the flamethrower turns on. Using some form of morale rules for the first time was fun, different experience, and does a lot to help the DM consider the dungeon as a whole, connected space rather than a strict sequence of isolated encounters. When the PCs bust into the tower with 7 beastmen, the players managed to slay their champion before anything else happened. Rather than having all of them flee, I did a morale check and exactly half of them failed. The adventure mentions them fleeing into the courtyard, but since the party was right outside, I figured it made more sense for them to flee deeper into the dungeon instead, and, thinking ahead, realized this was a perfect reason to have the door to the secret room in the passageway slightly ajar. Then, when the players passed it by, I think more due to me being unclear in my description rather than a lack of curiosity on their part, I decided they would leave the secret room and find the 2 beastmen manning the battlements for reinforcements, leaving the door to the secret room wide open. Something minor, but I think it was a good first attempt about thinking how the dungeon can change when the PCs aren't necessarily present. Since character creation took a bit of time, and again, we were operating on an unknown baby-determined session length, and if you've had a baby, I mean, if you've had to take care of a baby, you know how unreliable setting any kind of clock can be. I skipped an initial best practices type spiel in order to get things going. This didn't affect things too much, as the players, one in particular, were generally willing to mess with things and drink the goo, as it were, but it did lead them kind of charging through the adventure and ending the first session on the beach of the titular Starless Sea without having explored most of the rest of the dungeon. In order to avoid them missing nearly 50% of the module, I employed a bit of artifice by suggesting to my wife between sessions that they may want to explore further before boarding the longship. If any of my players are reading this, Emily, and I apologize for this little bit of deception. It probably parenthetically won't happen again. I mean, I think, this is one of the interesting things, right? So they're rushing too far. I tend to not stop folks from doing that, But it's one thing if it's kind of in a campaign game. It's another thing if I was running a con game, and I think I'd want to try to build in some mechanism whereby I can either put something more in, or that's where you can think of things in a modular way, and not because you're trying to railroad them, but you want to give people 3 hours of game time. And if they're throwing through, it's like, oh my gosh, they're at the last room at the end of an hour. That's just not fun, right? So you want to give yourself some method to get people the full experience. You want to give them 3 hours. And then by the same token, you want to have a way of cutting out something if you're like, oh gosh, I'm coming up against the clock and they're nowhere near the end. So you probably want to cut something out. So sometimes thinking about things in a kind of modular way of putting in and out can help in those instances. But if it's a campaign game, I would just say, well, it's either kind of its own reward, which is if you're on a clock to get somewhere and you were able to get there without exploring half it, then you were lucky enough to find or smart enough to find the path you need to get through to get to it, then hey, that's more on you, because generally speaking, you're either going to get loot, which you might want or need for the fight ahead, maybe, but you're probably going to lose resources that you're not going to get back before the end. So it's, oftentimes it's going to work to the party's benefit if they're able to sidestep a lot of stuff to get to the end, presuming that they're not missing some vital tool or something they're going to need at the end of it. So that's just them being efficient in a way. All in all, Sailors is as good of a first exposure to DCC as it is reputed to be, and I hope the group enjoyed it as much as I did. I'm generally satisfied with the very minor changes I made, and I don't think I'd do much of anything differently if I ever had an occasion to run it again, other than start with 12 PCs rather than 16 in a group of 4 players. I was initially planning on running the other acclaimed early Stro adventure, Doom of the Savage Kings, next. Again, Sailors into Doom being a very common DCC campaign opener. But since I believe we'll only have 2 weeks of sessions before being interrupted, and I want to minimize weeks off mid-adventure where possible, I think I'll be going with Chanters in the Dark by Daniel J. Bishop instead. So there we go. What a wonderful session report. Thank you very much for sharing this. Goodbye to a shoe. I guess they don't list any other name. Next up is getting started with original Dungeons and Dragons. Let's see if we can get through this one in the time allotted. I should send this one to Daniel since he's the OD&D expert. All right, there's the link. This is from the blog, The Fantastic is Fact. Intro. Dungeons & Dragons recently had its 50th anniversary. A game with such staying power is well worth exploring, I'd reckon. There's no denying that it's the world's, and they crossed out, greatest, most popular tabletop role-playing game, and has been enjoyed by millions of people for decades. Your interest piqued you enough to check out this blog post, but hasn't quite pushed you over the edge to actually try the game, or perhaps you want to get started but don't know how. Either way, I'm here to help you. This article is not intended to introduce you to the art or science, perhaps, of old-school play. There are already numerous writings that cover that topic well. Rather, I hope to provide a glimpse into the ever-evolving world that is original Dungeons & Dragons, hereafter referred to as OD&D. For such an old game, there's still a lot of life left in it. Why OD&D? It's worth briefly asking ourselves why we'd play OD&D in 2025. Since OD&D's inception, countless tabletop role-playing games have emerged, and more are published every year than anyone could hope to play in a lifetime. Besides the aura of authenticity or authority that comes with being the first to do it, or at least to do it well enough to gather a large following, why do so many continue to play or even discover OD&D for the first time 50 years after its inception? Simplicity. First, while I would not classify OD&D as a rules-light game per se, it is certainly much easier to learn than its 5th or is it 6th edition. OD&D is relatively straightforward because it leaves so much up to the players themselves, and less so to strict rules that must be adhered to. One discovers not just a world by playing, but also how to play in said world through the collective creation of house rules as each campaign unfolds. The game leaves many gaps for referees and players to fill in on their own based on the tastes of their table. I want to add here that there's just a lot of stuff also just missing from OD&D. I think the one that I've mentioned before, that's the first one that comes to mind, is like missile weapon distances just don't show up. You have to check chainmail, or you're supposed to check chainmail. Right? They name check Avalon Hill's outdoor survival as something you should have that doesn't come in the box, or certainly doesn't come with a digital edition. So it's kind of lacking, and I think they really depended upon people coming from a wargaming background to have familiarity with a bunch of wargaming stuff to sort of backfill at the time, those kind of things. So I would call it a rules-like game, because a lot of rules-like games also fall into that same, have that same issue, and maybe some of them deliberately do that, where they kind of rely on you having read more things that are rules complete than they are, and so you just backfill in. So the rules-like game comes in and gives you a few things, and they just kind of figure that, well, either intentionally or unintentionally, you're going to just go ahead and fill in the stuff. And I know that's what some people who have been really frustrated by rules-like games, that's one of the big things they'll speak to, is that there's a difference. You can be rules light and complete. You can also be rules light and incomplete. And a lot of the rules light games we find are actually incomplete. You just don't realize it when you first read it, because you are completing it for years yourself. And OD&E definitely has that part of it. It is rules light because there isn't a lot to it. It is also incomplete, and that there's stuff missing. And actually reading it now, coming from the whole history, the 50 years of gaming history we have, I think is actually easier than if you were to come from nothing and just read OD&D for the first time, because you can so readily just backfill things from homes, just from blogs, from BX, from AD&D, from, wherever. Okay, back to it. The game's creators suggest as much in OD&Ds afterwards. All right, and here's a quote. There are unquestionably areas which have been glossed over. While we deeply regret the necessity, space requires that we put in the essentials only, and the trimming will often have to be added by the referee and his players. We have attempted to furnish an ample framework, and building should be both easy and fun. In this light, we urge you to refrain from writing for rule interpretations or the like, unless you are absolutely at a loss, for everything herein is fantastic, and the best way to describe how you would like it to be, and then make it just that way. On the other hand, we are not loath to answer your questions, but why have us do any more of your imagining for you? Write to us and tell about your additions, ideas, and what have you. Right, and so that's, yes, that part is definitely there, true, but there's stuff that just seems to be kind of, missing as well. And I read a letter from Gygax a while back on the channel where he basically says as much. They knew it was incomplete when they shipped it, but they wanted to ship it because they felt like they couldn't sit on it, which I think was probably the right call. All things considered, yeah, you could have play tested that for a while and really tried to drill down and do it, but someone else might have published something first, and then we'd be thinking about that game, and D&D might have been an afterthought, or one of those, oh, remember this other game that came out? And instead they put theirs out first, and they got that mind share, market share, all that jazz. So it was probably a worthwhile doing. There's certainly room to argue that needing to come up with your own rules can be more daunting than flipping through dozens of pages to find a specific rule for a specific scenario, because coming up with rules that work requires experience, time, and effort. I'm here to tell you that off-the-cuff rulings that keep the game going are perfectly fine as long as everyone at the table agrees with its logic. Relax, just keep the game moving and embrace the fluidity. Compared to picking up a game like D&D 5th Edition, Pathfinder 2nd Edition, Vampire the Masquerade, Burning Wheel, or whatever else, OD&D is fast to teach and play. It's liberating. Yeah, and I should also say that you can oftentimes find an exemplar for what you want to do in the rules. So you can look at how something works, and I can't think of one off the top of my head. Well, maybe I would just say cleric turning is one, and you can see that cleric turning has a relationship between the character level and then the thing they're trying to turn, so that you can build up a kind of your own skill system really by just utilizing that. What's the level or challenge, if you will, the thing you're trying to do? What level are you? Tells you what you need to roll in 2d6. And so you can use that. Or, if there's a creature, sometimes you'll see a creature that has an effect that's similar to what's happening in the game. You can look at that creature's effect and just use it. Like, oh, this is like Medusa turning some of the stone. So I'll just, how does that work? So I'll use that. Or, oh, this is like a ghoul touch, if you want it. How does that work? Or this is like a dragon's fire breathing kind of thing, even though it's a trap and not a dragon. So how does that work? And then, so you can really find a lot of stuff by just looking at the different mechanics that the game gives you and seeing which mechanic works well, and then, fiddle-faddling the details. Low cost. OD&D is relatively cheap. You can buy all the PDFs on drive-thru for $10. The retro clones that you'll find below are free or generally printed at cost, so the entry threshold is quite low compared to those shiny new hardcovers you'll find in your local game shop. Even the fancier, more expensive retro clones aren't terribly pricey compared to the competition. History. OD&D has a lot of history. There are multiple books on the subject, as a matter of fact. OD&D is basically the ground zero of the hobby and therefore carries much historical interest. If you're interested in seeing where the hobby evolved from, there's probably no better place to start than here. along with reading the elusive shift. Community. And with that historical interest comes lots of fantasy blog posts, get it? Theorizing and pontificating on all the weirdest and most wonderful ways. OD&D has a strong community surrounding it 50 years on, including a strong DIY culture that carries the faintest scent of the early days of the OSR that has long since been lost to fancy Kickstarters, backer kits, Exalted Funeral, and other boutique storefronts. Below you'll find a list of some of the best blogs out there for the game. On to first steps. First steps. So, first things first, you need to decide whether you'll just use the Little Brown Books or go Little Brown Books plus supplements. What? Little Brown Books. All right. Well, I was just reading out they were using the abbreviation, and I decided to use the actual words, and then they're going to say, so Little Brown Books, or LBBs, refer to the Little Brown Books, or 3 Little Brown booklets that comprise the original game. They make up the 1974 version of the game. Many OD&D players prefer to play with the original booklets and nothing else because they feel that the supplements begin to pull the game farther and farther away from its wargaming roots that are so central to its early appeal, add various unnecessary complexities, and ultimately, some would say, make the game begin to feel like the redheaded stepchild of future, more fleshed out iterations of the game. Others, however, prefer to play with the supplementary material because it's in those very supplements that we find the foundations for what tabletop role-playing games would become today, at least in the OSR space, such as variable weapon damage, for instance. That's right, when you were playing with the 1974 rules, you'll be rolling D6 for every weapon. I still roll D6 for weapons in my BX games, so there. They also add several classes and options that flesh out the game into something juicier with more to sink your teeth into. The game did not originally include the Thief class, for instance. No, that class came with the first supplement entitled Greyhawk. Playing with material from the supplements might be a much easier sell for new players than the comparatively light options found in the first 3 core booklets. Once you've made your decision, it's time to start to decide which version you'd like to play. Choosing a game. There are several options for playing OD&D in 2025. Note that this list is not necessarily comprehensive, but it covers all the most widely recommended and played games with polished, finalized versions. If anything can be truly considered finished. For a huge list of retro clones, and there's a link to a page. The originals. All right, so he's going to go through choosing which one. I'm not going to read through these. The originals. Delving Deeper, I like a lot. I know that they was in kind of active development for a long time. I wonder if it still is, but I think it's really good. And it has a really nice web interface. Like before, I think it was the first one I saw to do that. Way before Old School Essentials had kind of an online sort of rules repository. Delving Deeper had one, and it was great. Okay. The Littlest Brown Book is another one. Iron Falcon, Swords and Wizardry. I would avoid White Box FMAG because I heard, from what I understand, I think it's this one. So maybe I shouldn't speak out of turn. One of these, it might be this one. They used a lot of material that someone else wrote and didn't. There was some funkiness of what they did or didn't do. I want to say maybe it's just this. I'll have to, scratch that. I won't comment until I can remember which one of these. There's one of these that they took a lot of stuff. I think it was from Swords and Wizardry. And they just took it and just sort of ripped it and threw it in and didn't give credit or anything. But I don't know. I don't remember which one of them it is. So rather than be wrong, I'll hold my critique, and when I can confirm it again, I'll post something about it. There's Fantastic Medieval Campaigns, Blue Home. Yeah, it's more Holmesian, but okay. Then we have some Where to Find Players, forums, discords, next steps and further reading. So the personal recommendations from this blogger: grab a retro clone from list above. I personally recommend Delving Deeper for the 3 Little Brown Books, or Swords of Wizardry Complete Revised if you want the kitchen sink. Grab some D6s, D10s, and D20s, unless you select Swords and Wizardry, in which case a standard set of polyhedrals. Play a few rounds of combat on your own to get the gist of it. For inspiration, take out the Chaoclypse YouTube channel or Bandit's Keep. Hey, there you go, Daniel. You get a little plug, though not a link. Embrace the liberation from lots of rules and get comfortable with rulings on the fly to keep the pace of the game going. As long as your players are on board for that type of experience, you're all going to have a good time, I promise. Hit up any of the Discord servers linked above for any questions you have. Have fun. All right. And there we go. Cool. So that was a fun read. I've had a lot of fun. I mean, Daniel's game is not exactly OD&D. It's kind of chainmail. I would actually call it more chainmail with OD&D. You know, some people would say, "Oh, OD&D with chainmail." I feel like Daniel's is more chainmail with OD&D, but it's a lot of fun. I definitely think there's no reason not to give it a read and see it. There's always every edition adds some things that those authors and editors bring to it. I also think sometimes they lose things before, and seeing you read some stuff in there, and I remember running into something like, "Oh man, I really wish this had carried forward more than it did." You know, it's there, and then maybe it's kind of then it maybe makes it to BX, but it's not emphasized as much, and then it just falls away. And there's some stuff that just seems to kind of fall away sooner. But you find there's a lot of gems and fun things in there. So yeah, I definitely think you give it, if anything else, give it a read, and definitely you could find yourself a retro clone that's free or cheap. Granted, you won't be getting the exact words, and sometimes it's nice to actually read what Gygax and Arneson said as opposed to someone's interpretation of what they said, because also sometimes you find that with that rewriting, you lose some clarity or even just a little bit of the flavor that the original had gets lost as somebody has rewritten it in a slightly different way. All right, folks. Well, that's all. That's all for this one. Thanks for hanging out. As I mentioned at the start, I will be at a CleeseCon Saturday and Sunday. Look for me. It's definitely on Saturday and probably on Sunday. But if you're going, it starts Friday evening, but I just can't. 3 hours to go for 3 hours. I can't make that work, and I just got stuff going on. But I'll be there Saturday and Sunday. So if you're in the Philly, Jersey area, swing over, say hi, roll some dice, do some good, all that yada yada yada. Other than that, I will be back. I'll be back tomorrow. I should be around on Friday, and we'll take it from there. So enjoy the rest of your day, night, whenever you end up watching or listening to this. Game on, everybody, and I'll talk to you later. Bye now.